I want to talk to you this morning about Easter. Today is Easter, as that date is reckoned by most of the Christian West. And today there are believers all over the world who are celebrating the resurrection of Christ, specifically on this day. But in our tradition, in the Restoration Movement Churches of Christ, we do not tend to join the rest of the disciples of Christ in this annual celebration. And the reasons for that are pretty simple and straightforward. In the Church of Christ, we've determined that we should model our worship after that of the first century church, and that as such, when it comes to doing church, we will do only that which we receive from the New Testament by way of command, example, or necessary inference. And traditionally, it's been held that there is no biblical evidence that the church of the first century observed Easter, and therefore, neither do we. Now, we're not alone in this conviction, but the list of other churches that abstain from the observance of Easter is pretty short, consisting of the Religious Society of Friends, the Free Presbyterian Church of Scotland, the Seventh-day Adventist, plus a handful of obscure splinter groups, some of whom are a little bit scary. I looked at the websites of some of these churches who eschew Easter, and I don't think I would go on their premises without a tether and an extraction team at hand. They're a little intense. I'm not really kidding about that. And it kind of makes me cringe whenever I have to explain to somebody outside the church that we don't really do Easter and why we don't really do Easter. Even the Mennonites and the Amish do Easter. Because frankly, we're not really in good company on this matter. And some of the things that anti-Easter people say to defend their position can be pretty scandalous. Now, in Colossians 2:16 through 17, Paul says, "Therefore, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink, or with regard to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath. These are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ." And as I understand Paul here, what he's telling us is that we are free to celebrate holy days if we want to, and we're free to ignore holy days if we're so inclined. And frankly, as far as I'm concerned, that's all the biblical authority I would need to celebrate Easter. But not everyone agrees with that. To many of our brethren, what Paul says here simply isn't acceptable. And I've met a few people who are pretty adamant about that. I've known a number of Christians who simply cannot accept that there can be two right answers to one question. There are some people who think there can only be one right answer, that every other answer must be wrong. And not just suboptimal or dispreferred or even vexatious, but wrong, demonstrably wrong, indictably wrong, condemnably wrong. Accordingly, the difference between observance or non-observance of Easter can't be innocuous or oddiferous. It needs to be a moral difference. And in order to create that moral difference, people tend to look for a way to indict the observance of Easter. And they find it quite handily in the name of the holiday itself, as it is rendered in English in the word Easter. After all, they will state with confidence that it's a well-known fact that the English word Easter is derived from the Anglo-Saxon word Ustra, which is the name of a West Germanic goddess who for a short time prior to the 7th century was worshipped by Northumbrians during the month of April. And from this, we know that Easter did not originate in Christianity, but it originated in paganism and is therefore to be rejected as a legitimate Christian celebration. Now, that's a pretty damning claim. Those are pretty harsh words. And if it's true then we should do away with Easter, lock, stock, and barrel, because if it's really pagan rather than Christian in origin, then there's no place for it in the church. Not at all. As Paul said in 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 18, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness? What accord has Christ with Belial? Or what portion does a believer share with an unbeliever? What agreement has the temple of God with idols? For we are the temple of the living God. As God said, I will make my dwelling place among them and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. Therefore go out from their midst and be separate from them, says the Lord, and touch no unclean thing. Then I will welcome you, and I will be a father to you, and you shall be my sons and daughters to me, says the Lord Almighty. So, is it true? Does the charge have any merit? Is Easter pagan rather than Christian in origin? Well, let me begin in addressing that question with an illustration from another topic. Ask yourself, how do you know that there's a God? If you know that, how do you know that? From whence does that knowledge come? And how do you know the difference between right and wrong? How do you know the difference between good and evil? For that matter, how does anybody know about God? How does anybody know the difference between right and wrong? Where does that knowledge come from? Well, your initial thought, your initial response to that question might well have been, well, I know these things from the Bible. Or I learned these things from my parents or from others who first learned them from the Bible. But those of you who've been listening to me for very long know that that isn't a very good answer to this question. Because while, yes, the Bible contains a great deal of information about God and about the nature of good and evil, the Bible itself tells us that it is not humankind's primary source. Or at least it's not our earliest source of knowledge in regard to God or in regard to the ways of God. Romans 1, 18 through 20. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of men who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what might be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that men are without excuse. Knowledge of the Father is the common possession of all humankind. No one has any excuse for denying the Father or for denying what can be known of God. The creation itself informs every human being on a foundational level, not just about the existence of God, but also, and more importantly, about his fundamental character. According to the Bible, nature itself reveals to us not only that God is, but also that God is righteous. Which knowledge would evade us if we didn't have knowledge of good and evil? But we do have knowledge of good and evil. Everybody does. In Romans 5:12, Paul says, therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, so also because sin is common to all humankind, death is common to all humankind. Now, to what is Paul referring here? How is it that sin entered the world through one man? Well, Paul here is talking about the fall. He's speaking here of that day in the Garden of Eden when Adam and Eve reached out their hands, plucked the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and ate of it. And when Adam did that, he didn't just receive knowledge of evil, he also received knowledge of good. And that knowledge has been passed down to us, generation after generation, to the present. And the evidence that basic knowledge of right and wrong is the common possession of every human being and of every human culture since the very beginning is manifold. You know, I used to have a teacher when I was in second grade who used to quote the Golden Rule all the time. Now, this was back in the days when teachers could do that before their kids would go home and tattle on their parents for quoting from the Bible. Mrs. Lovering quoted the Golden Rule almost every day. She would say, "Do unto others as you would have others do unto you." And she would tell us this is the wisest thing that Jesus ever said. Well, I don't know if it's the wisest thing or not. But if the new covenant really is new, then I would have to imagine that its wisest nugget should be more original than the Golden Rule, because Jesus did not think up the Golden Rule on his own. The Golden Rule has been part of human culture going back as far as recorded history goes back. It's not only ancient, but it's universal, showing up in every culture of the ancient world in one form or another. An early example of the Golden Rule is reflected in the ancient Egyptian concept of Mayat, their moral law, which encompassed the matters of the concepts of truth and balance and order and law and morality and justice. One narrative of Mayat is a story entitled The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant, which dates to before 2000 BC. Now that's before Christ, before David, before Isaiah and Jeremiah, before Moses, before Abraham, and even before Job. And one of the verses in The Eloquent Peasant reads, "Now this is the command, do to the doer to make him do." Now, beloved, that is an awkward translation. It's badly worded in English, but it's the Golden Rule, fully articulated 300 years before God came to Abraham in Genesis 12:1 and said, "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee." And you can find similar life principles articulated in the Code of Hammurabi, 1780 BC, where the words are an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. In the writings of Pittacus, 600 BC, where it says, "Do not to your neighbor what you would take ill from him." In Thales, who wrote, "Avoid doing what you would blame others for doing." In the writings of Confucius, who in 500 BC wrote, "Do not do unto others what you would not want others to do unto you." In Isocrates, 400 BC, it says, "Do not do to others what would anger you if done to you by others." And Buddha, 500 BC, wrote, "Whatever is disagreeable to yourself, do not do unto others." And the Sanskrit epic, the Mahabharata, dating to around 900 BC, reads, "One should never do something to others that one would regard as an injury to one's own self." Now, those are just a few examples, but clearly, basic knowledge of right and wrong is the common possession of every human being, in every culture, in every place, in every time, from the beginning to the present. No one, with or without Christ, has any excuse for failing to grasp, appreciate, and live into this basic knowledge expressed in the Golden Rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Now, why is that? How can that be? Well, that can be because of the divine agency at work in creation. John 1, 1 through 3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. In the beginning, God the Father created the heavens and the earth. It was God the Father who said, "Let there be." But when he said that, the word that proceeded from his mouth was God the Son, who is Jesus, the Christ, who said of himself in John 8:12, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." And in Colossians 1:16 and 17, Paul tells us two very important things about God the Son in regard to the creation. By him were all things created, and in him all things hold together. And the takeaway of this for the purposes of today's lesson is that precisely because God the Son, who is the true light, and by whose life and power all things hold together, is the divine agent of creation, his fingerprints are all over the cosmos, all over the creation. And because of this, there is refracted light everywhere in the cosmos. And there always has been. And as such, it's not surprising that throughout the history of humankind, people all over the world have caught glimpses of the light, and from those glimpses have distilled countless nuggets of truth and wisdom and insight. And not just about life and living in general, but about God in particular, including insights into his divine nature and character, just as Paul says they ought to have done in Romans 1, 1 through 3. And as such, it's hardly surprising to learn that over the centuries, a number of people outside the scope of the narrow swath of history recorded in the Bible, which is largely confined to the lineage and legacy of one man, Abraham, have caught glimpses of the light of life and have discerned from those glimpses revealed truth out of due season. Now, here I just want to pause for a minute and talk about correlation, causation, priority, and sources. I'm going to be tying a lot of ideas together here, so, just try to keep track. First, you all know the difference between correlation and causation. For instance, it's a proven fact that there's a correlation between ice cream sales and the murder rate. Generally speaking, especially between the months of May and September, whenever ice cream sales go up, the murder rate also goes up. And vice versa. Whenever the murder rate goes up, ice cream sales go up. Now, that's what's known as a correlation. But there is no causation between the two. Ice cream sales do not cause murder, and murder does not cause ice cream to sell. Rather, it turns out that the two have a common cause, which is the summer heat. In the summer, when temperatures rise, this causes ice cream sales to rise, and it causes the murder rate to go up as well. Now, hold that idea in your head for a minute and consider this. Have you ever had it happen that you had an original idea, that you thought up something that occurred to you as a completely new idea, and then you go and look it up and find out that somebody else already thought of it? Well, the fact that someone else thought of it first doesn't mean that your idea wasn't original. in the sense that when you first thought it, it originated in your brain and not in that other guy's brain. The fact that the other guy had the same idea before you does not mean that you stole his idea or that you copied it. Now, it could mean that, even if you had never even heard of the guy prior to that, because memory is pliable. And it could be that you heard that guy's idea from a third party once upon a time, a long time ago, and forgot about it. And then when the topic came up again, his idea was brought to mind, but it occurred to you in such a way that you thought it was a new idea, an original idea, though it wasn't. Now, you didn't steal the idea per se, but it got into your head by way of some external source. And then when it resurfaced in your brain, you thought it was completely original. Now, that's called accidental plagiarism. But there's another phenomenon that sometimes occurs called multiple discovery. And that's when two people thinking about the same thing independently actually do come up with the same idea, completely separate and apart from one another. And that actually seems to be happening more and more. That's why the Nobel Prize for one new idea more and more often is being given to two researchers, or even three, who came up with the same idea even when they did not communicate with each other and did not collaborate in any way. And no one copied anyone. But in the world of ideas, this kind of coincidence is wildly unpopular. Researchers really hate it when this happens. And whenever there's a case of apparent multiple discovery, people will go to great lengths to try to prove that they made it to the finish line before their counterpart did. Because in the world of ideas, priority really matters. If you can demonstrate that you thought of it first, you win the prize. You win the accolades. And even if not so much as a single byte of your data ever made its way from your research to that other guy's research, even if his research has been completely independent of yours, later researchers will label his as derivative of yours. In the arena of original ideas, priority really matters. Priority. Who thought of it first? That trumps everything. Now, with all of those different things in mind, with all that in view, I've got a question for you. Who is it, do you think, who should get credit for the golden rule? Whose idea was it? Who thought it up? From whose mind did it come? I mean, Jesus of Nazareth, the incarnate Christ, is the 10th person at best to have articulated the golden rule in a forum where it was written down for all posterity. And there were at least 9 others who predate the incarnation of Christ, some of them by as much as 2,000 years, who are on record as having articulated the golden rule long before Jesus was ever born. So who gets the credit? Who gets the Nobel Prize? Now, you ask most historians, you even ask most Bible scholars, the majority of whom are not believers. Ask most researchers, and they'll tell you that the credit goes to the author of The Eloquent Peasant. He's the first person, or at least as far as we know, as far as we've discovered so far, who discerned and observed the golden rule. And everyone who came after him was simply repeating what they had heard or learned from someone else. Now, the conclusion from that is that whenever Christians follow the golden rule, they're not actually following a distinctly Christian principle. Rather, they're following a pagan principle, first set forth in the cult of the Egyptian goddess Maat, the daughter of the sun god Ra, and later adopted by Christianity by way of the Sermon on the Mount. Because after all, the Sermon on the Mount wasn't original to Jesus. It was a mishmash of things that had been said by other people long before Jesus ever came along, as were most of the teachings of Jesus. Now, by some standards, that could be considered a cogent analysis of the question at hand. But it does have at least one critical flaw. It makes one big mistake. And that is that it misapplies the law of priority because it omits one very important basic fact. And that basic fact is that while God the Son first set foot on the stage of human history only about 2,000 years ago in the incarnation of Christ, God the Son has also been at work in the warp and woof of the fabric of the cosmos for some 14 billion years. And that has a bearing on how the law of priority ought to be applied in this instance. After all, suppose that the author of The Eloquent Peasant was the first human being to discern the golden rule. Suppose that he was the first to come to the realization that the golden rule is self-evident. Suppose that that author of that epic was the first human being ever to be possessed of the knowledge of the fact that doing unto others as you would have them do unto you would be a blessing to everyone involved. Who do you suppose it was who revealed that knowledge to him? Who was it who caused that understanding to be self-evident? By whose hand did these words of truth manifest themselves in the understanding of the author of The Eloquent Peasant? Well, who else could it have been other than the Logos? Who else could it have been other than the Word that proceeded from God the Father's mouth when he said, "Let there be"? Who could it have been other than the very one who designed the creation in such a way that it was both capable of and prone to do exactly what Paul tells us it does do in Romans 1, 18 through 20. The only person who could have done that was God the Son. Jesus Christ, who said of himself in John 8:58, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was born, I am." And again in Revelation 1:8, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty." And of whom the Bible tells us in Hebrews 13:8, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday and today and forever. No one who has ever walked the earth as a human being was ever prior to God the Son, as he himself tells us in Revelation 22:13, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the end." And as such, it's the height of absurdity to suggest that his knowledge is derived from somebody else's mind, that his wisdom is secondhand, that his insights have been borrowed, that his words in the Sermon on the Mount or anywhere else are the product of plagiarism. It's ridiculous. Now, from there, let's go back to the question we started with this morning. The question of whether the observance of Easter is given to us in the New Testament by way of command, example, or necessary inference, or if, as so many have asserted, the celebration of Easter is actually a product of paganism rather than of sound Christian doctrine. Remember, the first charge against Easter is that there's no evidence that the first century church ever celebrated any annual feast of any kind. And the second charge is that it is a well-known fact that the English word Easter is derived from the Anglo-Saxon word ustra, and is therefore pagan. And from this, we know that Easter did not originate in Christianity, but is pagan in origin. But beloved, both of those charges are false. And that's really pretty easy to see if you do your research and reason through it carefully. First, just ask yourself, what is Easter? I mean, at its core, at its base, what is Easter fundamentally? Easter is an annual celebration of the Passion, an annual celebration of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. And then ask yourself, is there anything given to us in the New Testament by way of command, example, or necessary inference indicating that the first century church was celebrating the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ on an annual basis? And the answer to that is yes. Yes, there is, absolutely. There's clear biblical evidence, not only that the church was doing that very thing, but there's also clear biblical evidence that it was the apostles' intention that we should go and do likewise. Now, do you know what this celebration was called in the Bible? Passover. Passover. At the Last Supper, which was a Passover meal, Jesus transformed the Passover from being a Jewish celebration to being a Christian celebration. He did this by taking the elements of the Old Covenant, the bread and the wine, to bear on the New Covenant. And the language he used to do so couldn't have been more clear. Luke 22:19-20, and he took bread, and when he had gracified it, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And likewise the cup after they had eaten, saying, "This cup is poured out for you. This cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood." And in his account of that event, Paul in 1 Corinthians 11:25 gives us a longer quote from that night. In the same way, he also took the cup after supper, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." Well, to what cup was Jesus referring when he said this cup? Well, the Passover cup. And what did he mean when he said, "as often as you drink it"? Well, how often did the Jews drink the Passover cup? Once a year. Every year at Passover. And to what was Jesus referring when he said, "Do this in remembrance of me"? Do what? Well, eat the Passover. And with the meal, eat and drink what is now the Lord's Supper. Now, it's clear from several passages in the book of Acts that the early church was partaking of the Lord's Supper every time they met together, and most certainly on the first day of the week. But if I understand Matthew 26 and Mark 14 and Luke 22 and 1 Corinthians 11 correctly, the instructions that the Lord gave at the Last Supper were that once a year, his disciples were to partake of the Lord's Supper specifically in conjunction with the Passover feast, an annual celebration of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ. Now, I could be wrong about that. That could be an erroneous interpretation of these texts, but I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. Because from that day forward, every year, for the next 300 years at least, that's exactly what the church did. Every year they held a feast at Passover time And at that feast, they partook of the Lord's Supper in remembrance of Jesus, just as he had commanded them to do. We see evidence of this from 51 AD, 18 years after the Last Supper, where in Acts 18:21, Luke tells us, "But bidding them farewell, Paul said to the Ephesians, I must by all means attend this upcoming feast in Jerusalem, but I will return to you if God wills." And he set sail from Ephesus. 3 years later, in 54 AD, 21 years after the Last Supper, the feast is still being observed. Acts 26, we sailed from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. And within 5 days, we came to them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days. And that same year, in 1 Corinthians 5, 7 through 8, Paul commanded the Christians at Corinth to do the same. For Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us keep the festival, not with the old yeast of malice and wickedness, but with bread without yeast, the bread of sincerity and truth. Now, beloved, it seems clear to me that the Bible gives us plenty of authority to celebrate the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ in a conspicuous way on an annual basis. The early church did that very thing, and they did so at the command of the Lord himself, which command was repeated by the apostles. Those are the origins of Easter. That's where Easter came from, which origins, as far as I can tell, are completely free of any pagan influence. So where did anybody ever get the idea that Easter originated in pagan culture? Where did that notion even come from? Well, for a period of about 200 years, from 350 to 550 AD, there was a minor Western Germanic goddess named Ustra, who was popular in Northumberland County in England. And the people there celebrated her for 1 month out of the year, the fourth month, which would be April for us, but which was Easter month for them, which month was named for Ustra. Now, Christianity came to Northumbria, and Ustra fell by the wayside. But the names of the month stayed the same, which is something that we ought to be able to relate to, since the names of January, February, March, May, and June all have pagan origins. And since the church's celebration of Passover most often occurred in the fourth month of the year, the Northumbrians began referring to the Passover season as the celebrations of Ustra, which was short for Easter month. Well, in 731 AD, the Venerable Bede, a monk who lived in Northumbria, wrote a book entitled Ecclesiastical History of the English People, in which he made mention of this. Now, that book was 400 pages in length, and the Bede dedicated only about 3 sentences to this topic. But for some reason, that's the part of this book that has captured the popular imagination. And the usage of the word Easter to refer to the Christian observation of Passover from there spread like wildfire. But, and this is very important, this happened only where English and other Germanic languages were spoken. Christian Passover is called Easter only in a handful of languages. The rest of the world has always only referred to the annual celebration of the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ as Passover. Nothing from the mythology of Easter was ever carried over into Easter. Only her name survives, which, by the way, the name is hers and hers alone. The English word Easter has no etymological connections to Ishtar or Ashtaroth, either one. And if you read someone who says that they do, you're reading someone who hasn't done their research. And the Easter bunny and Easter candy, those are late additions to the holiday, both coming to us by way of Germany, and neither one have had any serious impact on the faith. Beloved, as far as I can tell, there's nothing pagan about Easter, and there never has been. It comes to us directly from Christ, who is our Passover. And it's affirmed to us by the Apostle Paul and has been perpetuated by faithful Christians year after year for some 2,000 years so far. And I hope that hearing that comes to you as good news. Happy Easter, everybody. That's my lesson for today.